It's not often that you watch a single episode, especially of a mystery-heavy show, and feel as if it instantly hits your personal strike zone.
Perfect!
Last night, I watched the first episode of Heavenly Delusion, a post-apocalyptic adventure anime based on a manga of the same name, or in Japanese, Tengoku Daimakyo. At least according to Google, this translates directly to Heaven Hell.
Oh jeez.
It's being adapted by Production IG and is officially streaming on Disney Plus and Hulu. With that said,
You can do whatever the f you want!
The series features two almost equally important and seemingly parallel plotlines, which will almost certainly converge at some point for reasons which will become obvious later. I'll be referring to them as Plot A and Plot B. It might sound confusing at first, but I'm going to start with Plot B. Plot B is a fairly archetypical walled garden plot. Within the safety of the walls, youths are taught math by CG robots. There's also an old director lady and a few assistants. Think somewhere between Early Darling in the Franxx, The Promised Neverland, Attack on Titan, Made in Abyss, and the Bible.
You're gonna need it.
It's interesting to see how quickly it shows self-awareness about its broader genre and how these stories usually go. When some of the students begin to figure out there may be a world outside of the walls, the director just comes clean, admitting that the clever children would have found out eventually. She also immediately lets Tokyo, the dude who asked, know about the abhorrent beasts and hellish conditions outside. This gives me some hope that the story won't lean too heavily in favor of the mystery box elements or go too far out of its way to obscure information and keep us in the dark needlessly. Plot A, on the other hand, is a post-apocalyptic adventure. Beyond the safety of the walls, a young lady named Kiriko serves as bodyguard to a younger boy named Maru. Kiriko searches for two mysterious figures from her past while escorting Maru to a place called Heaven. I'm pretty sure Heaven is the walled garden, if that's not obvious enough. Another thing I think shows self-awareness is how Plot A immediately provides us with adventure and exploration, something I think many of us were waiting on our toes for throughout many of the aforementioned shows, and in some cases never really got in earnest thanks to the subversive nature that came later. They scavenge, fend off thugs, and occasionally actually come across something they find interesting or pleasant in the otherwise fairly desolate remains of Tokyo. Plot A provides us with the adventure that the more sterile Plot B, most reminiscent of Early Darling in the Franxx, would otherwise be missing, and in turn, Plot B, as well as the pit stops along the way, help to keep the post-apocalyptic settings browns and greens from souring on us. What also helps keep that post-apocalyptic setting from souring is that the show is freaking beautiful. Even the most desolate environments are covered with color and texture, supported by painterly backgrounds. Overgrown plants, rusted metal, ransacked buildings, abandoned vehicles, and just general wear and tear litter the landscapes and breathe life into the environments. There are probably as many dynamic shots with slow zooms and pans as there are static moving manga type shots. Many of those dynamic shots take great advantage of the fact that they're animating on multiple independent layers, opting for some awesome parallax camera effects. The first episode alone has at least two of those big sweeping dynamic camera angles I so love to squee about. Dynamic camera angles, dynamic camera angle, dynamic sweeping camera angles. The CG actually fits in decently with the backgrounds. Hell, even the CG robots don't stick out too much, aided of course by the sterile environments they exist in. Some of those dynamic camera shots appear to be CG composites, likely composed of 2D assets in 3D environments, a technique that's been growing on me lately, and something I'll be discussing in more depth in my upcoming Chainsaw Man video. Speaking of anime with sex appeal, the fan service in this one is tastefully sexy when it's trying to be. However, it also gives us a lot to think about. Where did she get those scars? Why exactly is she trying to kiss herself in the mirror? What does all this say about her character? First time seeing a mirror? Is she infatuated with herself? Is she just that lonely, or is this some sort of self-affirmation? Is she practicing for Maru? Does she like women? Okay, I'll stop now. While I would typically be wary that the first episode of a fairly obscure show like this might simply be stuffed with its best and most dynamic shots, all you gotta do is take a look at the trailers to see that there are plenty of beautiful and dynamic shots we've yet to see, many of which look like they would take place much later in the season. As for the general vibe and presentation, it's definitely a slow burn so far. The action that was there, however, looked great, with some clear martial arts influence. There is plenty of dialogue throughout, but nothing overtly info-dumpy. Much of the dialogue is probably closer to real life than typical anime, but certainly not completely devoid of all anime tropes. Those tropes provide us with a fair bit of the show's humor, and I gotta say, that intermittent humor was executed quite well. There's one scene in particular with a very dramatic build-up playing off the context of a previous scene, which allows the otherwise generic punchline to take you completely off guard. With that said, the show has a big emphasis on the show don't tell appeal. The visuals alone end up providing much of the world building. We could probably guess based on the overgrowth of the suburbs of Tokyo, as well as the age of the director and assistants within the walls, just how far into this new age the setting is. While much of the world building can be grasped from the dialogue as well, it never feels especially in your face. For instance, Kiriko's, well, laser gun. As well as the moment when this lady lets Kiriko know that the port will only work during the day. This obviously implies the use of solar power.
Now we have a firm grasp of the obvious.
And gives us an idea of how modern a world this post-apocalypse stems from. For another example unrelated to world building, the show never tells you that Kiriko and Maru's food was laced with sedatives, but it's obvious from the context clues and surrounding scenes, and pretty much impossible to confuse. As for sound, much of the soundtrack is ambient music, supported by lots of Foley-style nature sounds when no music is playing. And can I say, though it might be somewhat easy to ignore at times, it so fits the tone and setting. There is also of course some electronic music and more traditional video game / anime OST type stuff in there as well. Now, I've seen some folks theorizing on whether or not there might be a supernatural element to the children within the Dome Society, based on the absurd physical abilities of Taka as well as Tokyo's visions. I think, however, much greater evidence is Kona's drawing of the fish with arms. I'm sort of cheating here, but you might have noticed if you look at this trailer, this is most certainly the same abhorrent beast as the drawing. I think this might imply some sort of psychic abilities, unbeknownst to the children themselves. With that said, Mimi Hime literally predicts the test at the very beginning of the episode, so yeah, I'm calling it. They're psychic. Did I mention the abhorrent beasts? My guess from what I've seen in the first episode as well as trailers is that there's some sort of mutated animals.
Human-animal hybrids.
Crow, fish. I think you can see what I mean. And on to the manga Adaptation Changes. And thank God I actually checked this time because there is a decent bit to talk about. First off, events are portrayed in a different order. Whereas in the manga, we get large, mostly chapter-long chunks of each individual plotline, the anime has them flip back and forth more often. There is also occasional full-on upper nudity in the manga, something I'm guessing won't be uncensored later based on the composition of the fan service we've seen so far. There are also some manga panels that aren't adapted at all. More fan service, suggestive conversations, sexual jokes, and some relatively normal stuff too. On the flip side, this fight scene isn't in the manga at all. I'm guessing it's an allusion to info we would have gotten later in the manga, but I wouldn't know. I'm at least finishing this video before I read anymore. For all of my excitement for what's to come, and as much as I loved this episode, here's why I'm still somewhat double-minded about only consuming or suggesting the anime alone. On one hand, it's absolutely freaking beautiful. The fan service is most certainly more palatable for a more general audience. Story beats have been rearranged in such a way as to make them more effortless to digest. Therefore, you can better understand how story beats from plot A might relate to plot B, given how they're interwoven. On the other hand, it is crystal clear to me that there are going to be both romantic and indeed sexual themes at the forefront of both plot lines, and I fear they might have been neutered. All in all, I'd say if you're really into this series, I would just check both out. I think that's going to give us a much fuller impression of the story's original intent moving forward. With that said, trigger warning.
Well, that was a fucked up story.
As it seems there aren't really any characters who are off the table when it comes to the aforementioned themes.
They're sexualizing young girls, and it's getting to the point where even I have a problem with it.
It's time to stop! Where the fuck are your parents?